Hello and welcome to Night Clerk Radio. This is episode 120, Solarpunk. And with me, as always, is my good friend and co-host, Burke. How you doing?
I'm all right. How are you?
Good. It's a sunny day out. Appropriate.
Technically is.
Yeah, talking about Solarpunk. Although it is cold here, we're recording in January. In the depths of the polar vortex or whatever it is, probably.
Stupid, sexy polar vortex.
Yeah.
I mean, hey, when it's 50 and then snowing and then 50 and then 0 degrees and then supposed to be 50 next week, it gets a guy thinking about climate change. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty appropriate for this. So, yeah, Solarpunk is a cultural movement that, if you haven't heard about or if you've never heard this term before, is sort of in some ways the opposite of cyberpunk. It is a science fiction focused movement, but instead of being dystopian, it is utopian. Mm-hmm. And the easiest way, I think, to explain it to someone is how I first encountered it, which was on a Tumblr post, which said, like, Pokemon, that's Solarpunk. And, like, if you think about Pokemon, like, it's a relatively peaceful setting, and they have technology. It's not medieval, but they don't have, vast factories spewing out pollution. It's bright and sunny, and people are more in tune with nature. There's way more nature in general.
Yeah.
And it's such a utopian society that a 12-year-old kid is allowed to run around on his own, raising basically fighting animals to go on a world tour.
Yeah, they're so in tune with nature, they can trap animals in their magic ball and make them fight.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Solarpunk is a more recent movement. I think it started around 2008 or end of the 2000s, beginning of the 2010s. And it encompasses a lot of types of media, fiction, music, games, and also architecture and real world political movement. Yeah, Burke, what did you know about Solarpunk before we started the episode?
I mean, I was broadly familiar with it. I think at some point I did a run through all of the punks, not just for music, but, to be clear, it is a tag on Bandcamp. There's lots of music tagged Solarpunk. But like you were saying, it's an overall art movement, I guess I would say, like, because it has a lot of facets to it that we can discuss. So there's some music. There's like architecture, like green architecture and like future sustainability driven architecture. There's a lot of writing, like environmental writing. And then, of course, kind of everything that just comes with like the punk aesthetic. And like you're saying, there's cyberpunk, which is probably the most popular, like that or steampunk. I would say cyberpunk.
Oh, yeah.
But, when Project Red releases steampunk 1877 or whatever.
Castle Falkenstein. Maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't really get or care about steampunk. But but there's kind of like this aesthetic ran off where it's like every mode of human production, you just kind of take that aesthetic and put punk on it at the end. And it's not always clear what they mean by punk.
Yeah.
In that case, I do think Solarpunk qualifies sounds too gatekeepy, but I can't think of a better word. But like, there's that punk has to have some aspect of being against the current inertia. Counterculture, I guess, would be like the common term. But you have to be like, in some way, we're operating in opposition to what's going on. And then the other big part of punk is like DIY, and that we have to kind of solve this ourselves because like systems and institutions won't do it for you. You have to do it yourself. And cyberpunk really started punk, but kind of ended up not so much. I don't know. Like I'd have to revisit the genre because I haven't really kept up with like new cyberpunk outside of games, which are kind of like almost like a pastiche of like 80s cyberpunk, but without any of like the ideology or like associated culture with them. Because like, I'm going to talk about cyberpunk for a bit just because people are familiar with it, and then we can move into like Solarpunk. Sure. But like my large touch point, for cyberpunk is the writing of the 80s and 90s, like your early Gibson, Stevenson, Shadowrun 3rd edition in the 90s, that type of stuff. And that was all like, there's this huge technological oppressive structure over you, generally corporate. Is kind of how it's portrayed, especially like in Shadowrun, where like there's the corporations and like they're run by like literal evil dragons and stuff.
Oh yeah.
And then the punk is that you're like in opposition to that, and that opposition's kind of been lost in some sense, where it's like if you played Shadowrun, but you play the fixer, like you play the corporate fixer instead of the Shadowrunners.
Right, you're gig economy workers, but mercenaries. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, it's like, that corporate opposition has been like lost over time. Mm-hmm. I think that was actually, I mentioned this before, but that was like my 2006, my senior thesis for when I did film study and stuff. It's like cyberpunk's no longer punk.
Yeah.
Because we've just become like a corporate feudalist.
Yeah. Oddly enough, earlier this week, I recorded an episode of another podcast I do, a lot of Narrative Distance, where we reviewed Cyberpunk Red, the newest edition of the Cyberpunk tabletop role-playing game that the video game is based on. And in Cyberpunk Red, it's interesting because the timeline of the tabletop game it started in 2013 in the fiction. Then there's Cyberpunk 2020. That's the most popular edition. Then Cyberpunk Red is 2045. But the video game is set in 2077. Mm-hmm. But Cyberpunk Red, one of the things is it's already no longer, it's a legacy media franchise at this point. And so it can't really change too much, or it stops being the thing that it says it is, right? Like it has to stay cyberpunk with a capital C. And so it's like this paleo future, this pastiche. It's no longer the future. It's no longer the future. It's an alternate future. It's an alternate timeline. And yeah, like you said, cyberpunk is not really punk. It's its own thing.
I think of like, you know, you talk about role-playing games. I think of, you know, the Blade Runner role-playing game where you play as the cop.
Yeah. Yeah, they didn't release the supplement where you can play the replicant, you know.
Yeah, but it was like a concession, like, oh, the main character was a cop, but you're not supposed to play cop. Oh.
Yeah.
I get it now.
And I think that kind of urge is, or the realization, you shouldn't play the cop is like one of the reasons why we have things like Solarpunk. Is because people are like, maybe this isn't the right way to talk about the future, because science fiction is often a way to talk about the future and the present too, right? And and Solarpunk is also connected to Hope Punk, which is another sort of Tumblr-driven movement, which is defined basically as the opposite of grimdark, which is a term that was coined in making fun of Warhammer 40,000, but also is often used to talk about like very dark dystopian cyberpunk futures, you know. And you can see all these movements are sort of related to each other as they're sort of critiquing each other or made in reference to each other. But yeah.
And if you're curious about this, before we move into like Solarpunk proper, which is where you're taking us, there's a whole Wikipedia page just called Cyberpunk Derivatives, which is what I went through, I don't know, like 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. There's like diesel punk, clock punk, deco punk, atom punk, etc.
I've heard of atom punk. That was
like Fallout-y, you know.
Exactly. That's the biggest representation of it. But so people just use punk now as a suffix, like in political scandals, everything's like something gate, right? Because of Watergate. Yeah. But the punk in Solarpunk is trying to be more. The people who are really proponents or have really written or commented on Solarpunk seem to be taking the punk aspect pretty seriously, because it's countercultural, post-capitalist, and just trying to fight the man, you know, and fuck it, we'll do it live kind of mentality, which is admirable too, because they're also trying to make it not so easily consumable as mass media, you know. But we'll see. So I guess we probably talk about like, what does it mean to be Solarpunk? Like, what is the thing? And so obviously the biggest thing is solar power, because that's where the fucking term comes from.
Yeah, green technology.
We don't have to be Luddites or neo-Luddites to escape climate doomerism. You know, the climate is, we can have a better future. I have read several essays on Solarpunk, and they often quote Mark Fisher and the cancellation of the future. And one way we can actually have a future is having like power, sustainable energy, electricity. Yeah. What are some other themes that you've noticed?
Well, so the renewable and sustainable technology is the big one. You alluded to Hope Punk, but I think that rejection of dystopia, this has to end, like things have to end up poorly. And then, like I said, in punk, DIY, you know, a lot of these technologies are ones like, you know, you don't have to go out and cause this huge carbon footprint of going out and getting groceries. You can just have a garden on your roof, you know, like, which gets into like a little bit of like weird petite bourgeois environmentalism of like, you know, if you're not careful, if you don't fix like all the structural issues, then you just have a handful of people who are capable of navigating that climate change and that hopeful future while leaving a bunch behind. So you have to like be careful how you think about it.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think it's a lot of times when I see Solarpunk, it's often conflated with like cozy sort of aesthetics. Like just on the Wikipedia page alone, it's also cottagecore, which is like, okay. idealizing rural life. It'll be very gardeny, and you have a little cottage, and like sort of gliding over the brutal amounts of manual labor having a cottage out in the woods or having a garden requires. They're like, you get to have tea and be nice and peaceful, not like you have to be up at dawn to tend to your garden and your livestock. And obviously Solarpunk said, well, you actually will have technology to sort of deal with that. But like, again, that's cozy stuff. I mean, is sort of often, we talk about lo-fi hip hop, and that's often put in there. But like Studio Ghibli films, which talk about war and, awful top end and industrialization, destruction of nature, and just traumas of war. But there's like, so cozy. It's the same kind of like.
I wonder if a lot of that cozy stuff also comes from just people don't see plants very often anymore, depending on where they live. So you just see a bunch of plants and you're like, that's cozy.
Yeah. No, that's
which I'm guilty of. I got a bunch of fake fucking plants for that reason. No lie. But yeah, I don't know. I didn't want to. I guess we can get into like criticisms just to get it out of the way, because I do largely think it's interesting.
Yeah,
and its popularity. I guess the other thing is like one thing that I thought was missing from a lot of these that maybe I just missed it. So if there's a good example, or I'm just miss something, have some media literacy blind spot or whatever, is that I think one thing they need to stress is like degrowth, right? And like scaling back consumption, because a lot of this is like, it's a utopia because, you can kind of live the way we always have, but we have better technology to do that, which may or may not be the case. Like you still can't consume at like the rate the average American does across the world.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess that's the utopian things. You have technology that allows it, or like there are, certain technological trajectories that would allow that. But that's one thing I think gets left out a lot of this stuff.
No, like, that's 100% true. And I think a lot of people don't realize, like Solarpunk is the critique of the capitalism required for, cancerous levels of short-term growth. And like, that's pretty easy to like, we have so much excess. We have so much waste. But even if we cut all that out, there still has to be some scaling back of standards of living. Like you have to like keep the same clothes and wear them until they literally fall apart. Like you can't just can't have Starbucks every day or every other day. You need to, like air travel would be more expensive and rarer. So you might have to take a boat and a train. Trains, you need trains, not cars, and there's a certain segment of the population think that trains are evil, So it would require a true Solarpunk future would require a radical change of our way of life.
Yeah. And maybe that degrowth or toning back consumption, whatever, is kind of implied in a lot of the anti-capitalist aspects of it.
Yeah.
So maybe they're just considered like bundled together, but it's a thing to say explicitly.
Yeah.
I think
at its core, I think Solarpunk is trying to bring back the sense of science fiction as a way to imagine a future that is not like our present, which is, increasingly rare. Like mass media doesn't really talk about it. Like the only kind of true futures are either so far in the future that they might as well be alternate universes like, Star Trek, or are hellish apocalypses caused by some invasion or some viral or some apocalyptic event, That's it. That's all the only choice visions of the future. Like there's nothing where like things have changed quite a bit, but they're not like, vision of hell.
Yeah. But it does become harder. For people to see these optimistic futures. They're not these visions of hell like you're talking about. There's the Mark Fisher phrase. I love cultural fracking.
Yes. I did see that.
Dividing people up. And then, we've talked about it in like ontology and other episodes. And you mentioned it earlier, is robbing people of their future, defuturing them, basically. So they don't feel like there's anything to work towards. And then Solarpunk is definitely like a pushback on that. And it's funny because that future, like you can tell when people get threatened by that. There's one article I'll include, largely because it's kind of funny whining to me. That's like, it seems optimistic, but it's not practical. And it's like largely complaining about the book Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson. I don't know if you read that.
I have not.
Caleb and I book clubbed it over COVID, but it's like a climate disaster future. And they're in that trajectory, and then they start this ministry, and all these nations work together, et cetera, et cetera. I'm very abbreviating the basic premise of the book, but it's like a speculative future about how we might deal with extreme climate change, like in a fairly optimistic sense. because like a bunch of nations just get their shit together and start working together, which is maybe the most hopeful and optimistic aspect of that book. But this article is just like, I don't think that kind of political maneuvering is acceptable. And it seems like the goal is to destroy capitalism as much as it is to stop climate change and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, all right. Well.
Yeah. Well. Yeah, there has been like one critique of Solarpunk I've seen is institutions or organizations embracing it, the aesthetic as a way of greenwashing, right? Like,
yeah, that we give you paper straws and
yeah, exactly. Like that's going to make all the difference. Or like a lot of architectural critics have, like the idea of greenifying buildings, especially skyscrapers, like putting a garden on the roof is just like is greenwashing. It's not really efficient or practical or sustainable. It's just something to make it look like you're doing something different, but not changing the underlying problems of the construction. And I know there's like this Solarpunk little short video that shows what a Solarpunk future could look like, but it was done by like some major corporation. I can't remember which, but it's like one of the biggest images. Like, this is what Solarpunk looks like. I do know one of the essays I looked at, the Solarpunk Life in the Future Beyond the Rusted Chrome of Yestermorrow.
Yes.
By Jay Springett, talks about the cultural fracking in a lot of detail. So we'll have links in there. You want to read up more on that. Yeah, the cultural fracking stuff is very interesting because, it's mining the past cultural forms for reboots and remakes. And like, there's no vision of the future. And it's just little comic Marvel movies and reboots of stuff you remember from your childhood or your parents' childhood now. Like all these Gen Zers are like, oh, my dad loved Ghostbusters. I guess I'll go see this remake or this reboot.
Yeah, it's funny because like 20-ish minutes into this, they haven't even really gotten to like specific examples. I feel like, and I'm kind of realizing they have a lot of maybe issues with Solarpunk that do with like genre in general that we've talked about, where you just kind of like establish somewhat organically, some terms arise and everything, and then they just get pulled in. You just tag everything like, oh, here's a plant. It's Solarpunk. It doesn't become like it loses all its meaning because there's a lot of stuff out there that's just Solarpunk. One thing that you linked me to is like all games tagged as Solarpunk on itch.io, which is like an independent game reselling site for basically anything from stuff you write to little computer games and everything. And there's tons that are just like have Solarpunk in the title. Solarpunk Futures. I'm not like trashing any of these because I don't know anything about them. There's too many to play, but it's just funny to see Solar Mech Squad, Solarpunk TTRPG. Yeah,
Solarpunk has become a popular theme or aesthetic in independent games, at least, and independent projects. I know there's a lot of science fiction written for it. A lot of people talk about like precursors to things that you could then retroactively tag as Solarpunk, like a lot of Ursula Le Guin's writing. Not a huge surprise there. Like they specifically list the novel Always Coming Home and The Dispossessed, which But in terms of film, they talk about Miyazaki films like Porco Rosso, maybe. So. Or Wall-E, which
that starts to be like a little like I was like, I don't know about that one. I have to see
Avatar, the Avatar films.
It's got jungles. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah,
and I guess aesthetic's the right word, where something gets transmogrified from political idea or like a perception of the future or some overall message into an aesthetic. Like you just strip it out of all its context, which we love to do.
Yeah, but there's also, it's popped up in Vaporwave too. So, for example, there's Solarpunk A Possible Future, a compilation put out by Global Pattern, which is a nice anthology. Came out in March 2021. And I mean, we've talked about like Nature Wave and that kind of Eco Wave, those kind of like nature-y themed Vaporwave subgenres. So this is very much along those lines. Like if you told me it was Nature Wave, I'd believe you. If it's Solarpunk, sure. It sounds peaceful and meditative and more natural sounding than a lot of Vaporwave, but it's in the same spectrum. But
and the other album, same year actually, 2021, was Desert Sand Feels Warm at Night. Had a Solarpunk tagged album. It's kind of the same idea, which the cover looks familiar. We may have done it on the show.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Because but I was just thinking about it because Does the same feel as Warm. I just had a really nice interview on Hot Takes. Mm-hmm. They're kind of on my mind. And I was like, oh, yeah, they did have some stuff tagged as Solarpunk.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because you get into those like nano genre divisions of what does this term mean in this context?
Well, I think a lot of it is, we're talking about the cancellation of the future. And I think a lot of that is, you can tie that to the Cold War, right? Like capitalist societies had to depict a better future in order to compete with communism on an ideological basis, right? And then like, our future is going to be great. It's going to be, you got to keep working. We got to defeat those evil communists. And as soon as communism fell as a, main ideology competitor, they's like, who cares anymore? You don't have a choice. Yeah. And so that idea of science fiction offering visions of something to strive for, utopia is not perfection, but the struggle, or at least that idea. And so people want, it's a void. And so this is sort of like an organic movement trying to fill that void by like, this is it. We have bicycles, but we also have computers, and maybe there was a little bit of an apocalypse, but we got over it. And,
we've all moved on.
Yeah, we've all moved on. 90% of the people died, but the remaining 10% people have computers and nice gardens, and it's fine. It's a work in progress, I think. So, but it's something. And I mean,
it's not nothing.
It's not nothing. Thank God there's somebody's like, no, we're all just gonna. The doomerism can get tiring after a while.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I'm guilty of that.
Yeah. But it's interesting because it's a multi media movement. It's not just music or games or fiction. It's all of these things, and there's also like a lot of Art Nouveau aesthetics in it, which is
that's true,
which is an interesting pairing, but I guess that goes into the garden aesthetic too, the cottage core elements. We want to have this.
Now, as my local architecture aficionado, other than covering skyscrapers and plants, have you thought much about solarpunk architecture?
There are precedents too. Like again, back in if you can retroactively claim things,
you can. I think if we can go back from 2008 and claim Penguin and stuff, then why not?
One thing I am aware of are there are a lot of people trying to figure out architectural ways to be more sustainable, use less exploitative methods to build, and they've looked at there's Earthships, which are using earth and materials and trying to be like, I guess the classic example of architecture is it used to be people would build more to adapt to the local environment. Like in very hot environments, you would build the houses raised up so that air would circulate underneath them to create cooler environments. Or like if you're in very cold environments, you would build to preserve heat, to insulate more, right? But building methods have become more standardized because it's just easier to export and easier to build materials. If you just make the same kind of house regardless of the environment. And Earthship is sort of like off the grid, kind of in the opposite direction, right? And so I think that's something I would tag Earthship as a solarpunk movement.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's a lot of the DIY and sort of like trying to get the same level of comfort or quality without using, industrialized or the same kind of building methods you'd use and techniques and materials you'd use for make mansions and that kind of thing. So there's been broad movements in that, but like the big thing I can think of is Earthships.
Yeah. Okay. Because I was also thinking there's, I guess it's not really solarpunk, but with all the recent sort of terrible fires out in California, there's like some viral articles of like, oh, this sustainable house didn't burn down because I think it was like concrete instead of wood, basically, which always makes me think like, well, how many did, and we just don't make articles about it, right?
Oh yeah.
You kind of have to you always have to always have to correct for that selection bias.
Yeah, I think there's anything that is like, how do I build something that is more sustainable, has a lower footprint, and without being greenwashing, something that's actually not just trying to have the appearance of it, without something that's actually trying to put the work in. I think that's the biggest problem with architecture now, is that there's so much greenwashing. Like it's very trendy now to have gardens or having green on your giant building. but that doesn't necessarily mean it's actually sustainable or if it's like inefficient or waste of resources. So yeah, I don't think there's been a lot of movement. I know Singapore has built a lot of green architecture, but yeah, I don't know if it's
like those ideas of like
yeah,
oxygen positive, they kind of say like zero carbon footprint, but there's like these positive scaled.
Oh, eco-brutalism, just putting gardens in brutalist concrete buildings,
concrete plus plants.
Yeah. That's basically what my understanding of it is. But yeah, I think Solarpunk would be, again, using the architecture of the building to the way it's built to be have a lower footprint instead of just like build a American suburban house in the middle of the desert. Like, Arizona is the opposite of Solarpunk because like, Jesus Christ, they don't build houses. They just build them the same whether they're in, Missouri or in Arizona. It's like, well, it's going to have a very high HVAC footprint in Arizona where it gets to 120 degrees 5 months of the year, 6 months or 8 months or whatever it is. Also, I think in general, denser, more walkable, reducing car imprints, which is a bigger movement in general than just Solarpunk.
Yeah. Anti-car stuff.
Yeah. Pro bicycle. Or public transit, I mean, that's the thing. Architecture is just like stuff we already know how to do. We just don't because certain companies find it more profitable to have cars and roads and, concrete everywhere. So
interesting. Yeah. I feel like I haven't really gotten to like a thesis about any of this.
It's a kind of an amorphous movement, right? Like, it's in general just trying to like, I think the biggest message is we can still do something about this. It's not all don't give up, keep fighting, keep, trying. And I think that's the biggest message of Solarpunk is like, no, it's not all over yet. We can do something about it. We just have to, keep fighting the good fight more than anything else. So, yeah.
It's just coming up on 20 years of we can do something else.
Yeah. Well, Solarpunk's only been like 15 years, 10, 15 years, maybe.
Almost 20.
Yeah.
I guess 50 is closer to 15 than 20.
Yeah.
That's fair. That's me being negative.
And, solar power is growing exponentially around the world, even if certain governments don't like it. Like, it's still now just more efficient. So the market is switching over to use of more wind and solar. So we got that going for us. Yay. But yeah, I think it's something worth checking into and reading up on and just being aware of as a movement. There's interesting things created in the scene, and there's some good music too. So
they're actually good albums. I sort of just picked two because I knew them. I remembered them. I'll throw them in the show notes. Outro sample will probably be from one of them. So definitely check that out. I'll put all these essays in the show notes. I think for me, the whole purpose of this episode was like an excuse to self-educate a bit about it. Because they've always heard the term, but never really dug into it. So some good cursory reading. I may dig a little deeper because there may be more specific like subtopics. Yeah. Which if somebody out there can think of one or is like super into this, let us know. I think picking something a little bit more narrow for like a future Solarpunk discussion.
Oh, sure. Like a particular work or a couple of works.
I do think it's of like a lot of these cyberpunk derivatives, as I called them. I do think it's the most interesting. I don't know. It feels like it has the most juice as like still having some ideological or like philosophical underpinnings behind it to latch onto versus some of these others that are just like, oh, they wore these coats in the 40s. So this is coat punk.
Yeah.
Like that type of stuff is not as interesting to me, like the purely aesthetic movements. But I think if you can reclaim some of the ideology, I keep saying that's like such a scare quotes word in people's heads. So it can mean something totally different depending on philosophy. But taking some of those ideas or that philosophy and kind of wrestling it back from the jaws of just being a contextless aesthetic. I think there's something interesting there.
Yeah. And I think Solarpunk is also interesting to be aware of because in general, environmentalism, critiques of capitalism or like technology and sustainability, like a lot of people tend to go in the opposite way of just being like, we need to get the Luddite way, the neo-Luddite, like we got to get rid of all of it. We got to be, neo-primitivists and that kind of thing. And I remember this one essay years ago that I read about dark ecology, which is like, we got to go all the way to this thing, get rid of all the technology, go back to like a, pre-industrial society. And Dark Ecology by Paul Kingsnorth, it's an old essay. You have to use archive.org to Wayback Machine in order to pull it up. But it starts out with like, yeah, using a scythe is more efficient than like a lawnmower. It's just muscle power. There's no gas. There's no complex parts. If you learn how to use a scythe, you can cut your lawn pretty quickly, pretty efficiently. But like a society that uses scythes instead of lawnmowers is also a society that has to admit that like 90% of the population is just going to die. Like we have to get rid of vaccines. We have to get rid of food production. We have to get rid of so much. So like if you're this kind of like, we got to get rid of all technology proponent, you're advocating for genocide, which is, true. And so Solarpunk is like, well, maybe we could balance this. Maybe we could still have technology and not destroy the environment. So Dark Ecology also talks about Ted Kaczynski and his writings and like so it's like Solarpunk's like, you don't have to go Ted Kaczynski, I guess is the way to put it.
It's the Unabomber for all you kids out there.
Yeah. So that's Solarpunk. We could, pollution and a lot of the excesses of technologically advanced capitalism is bad, but that doesn't mean we have to get rid of everything. Because if we do, that means that almost everyone's going to die, of preventable diseases or starvation or, stuff like that. So yeah, it's complicated, but it's a interesting movement to think about at least. And there's a lot of interesting work. So yeah, I guess later this year we can dig up some Solarpunk works and talk about them specifically. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. We had a lot of fun reading up and learning about Solarpunk, and it's a good excuse to learn. Yeah, as Burke said. Our next episode, we're going to be doing more digging up things to learn about them. We're going to be talking about some lost media, specifically a soap opera, and what kind of work that inspired. So don't miss it. I love lost media icebergs and lost media in general.
Yep.
So
yeah, I'm curious what we'll dig up.
Yep. And if you want to hear more from us, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/nightclerkradio, where we talk about all kinds of fun things. And we recently talked about Hallmark movies as a weird, very stratified subgenre of film with our friend and Caleb Stokes, author of Red Markets, an economic horror RPG, and a Delta Green writer, and okay human being overall. So, and we are on Blue Sky. I'm on Blue Sky, so you can check us out there. We have a website, nightclerkradio.com. And don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell your frenemies, your enemies to podcast friends to lovers pipeline. Yeah. Whatever it is that works for you, just tell the people about Night Clerk Radio. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.